Ava Morgan, a resilient Marine veteran, endures cruel mockery from construction workers about her prosthetic leg as she walks to the VA. Unbeknownst to them, her limp was earned dragging wounded comrades through gunfire in Fallujah, a sacrifice that cost her a limb. As Foreman Rick Tanner's insults escalate, a quiet observer named Logan Beck watches from his car, recognizing Ava as the hero who saved his life and others in that same battle. Driven by a fierce sense of honor, Logan, a retired Navy SEAL, makes a single decisive phone call. Moments later, 3 black SUVs filled with unreadable, disciplined Navy SEALs were a roar onto the site, blocking the main entrance and silencing the jeers. What reckoning awaits the mockers? And how will Ava react to this powerful, unexpected intervention? If Ava's powerful story of resilience and honor resonated with you, please consider supporting our channel. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this impactful message, and subscribe to my channel for more inspiring true stories that remind us what true courage looks like. Your support helps us share these vital narratives and highlight unsung heroes. Somebody call the VA. We've got a stray on site. The foreman's voice cuts sharply through the midday noise, louder than the drills and hammers echoing around the construction site. Ava Morgan didn't flinch. She kept walking, her pace steady despite the limp in her step. Her prosthetic leg peeked out just beneath the frayed hem of her jeans, its shape unmistakable even in the heat haze rising off the asphalt. "Wrong turn to the welfare office, sweetheart," another worker jeered from somewhere behind the gate. His voice triggered a ripple of laughter, coarse, mocking, thoughtless. Ava's fingers tightened around the brim of her Marine Corps cap, her knuckles pale, jaw clenched. She didn't slow down. Her eyes stayed locked forward, shoulders square. Let them laugh. They had no idea. No one here knew what she had crawled through, what she'd survived. They didn't know she'd dragged fellow Marines through a hellstorm of gunfire, or that her limp came from an explosion, not a scam. Her injury wasn't a story of failure. It was one of fire, of sacrifice. She didn't owe them an explanation. She owed no one anything. 15 minutes passed, then everything changed. The loud, familiar rhythms of construction, metal clanging, engines rumbling, men yelling over the roar, abruptly stopped. Silence swept through the job site like a sudden cold wind. 3 sleek black SUVs barreled onto the gravel lot, engines humming low and dangerous. They blocked the main entrance with clinical precision. Doors opened, and 7 Navy SEALs stepped out in synchronized formation. Every movement they made was measured, silent, and sharp. Their faces revealed nothing. Their boots hit the ground with a unified weight that spoke louder than any words. No one could tell who they had come for. Workers looked at one another with confusion, apprehension flickering across their sunburned faces. But the moment the SEALs turned and walked toward Ava Morgan, without hesitation, without needing to ask, every man on that site froze where he stood. The laughter that had rung out earlier vanished like smoke. Not a single word was spoken. For the first time that day, there was only silence. After she left the Marine Corps, Ava hadn't returned to fanfare or folded flags. No one stood with banners or handshakes to welcome her home. Instead, she came back to a modest apartment tucked behind a worn-out strip mall on Houston's east side. 2 rooms, a narrow balcony, and neighbors who rarely looked up from their lives. Still, it was hers, a quiet refuge where no one asked what she'd seen, where silence became as reliable as the ticking of her old wall clock. Every Tuesday, she followed the same ritual. She packed her olive-drab duffel bag and slung it over her shoulder with practiced ease. Then she boarded the 77 bus that carried her through the city to the VA Medical Center. Inside the bag were her prescription bottles, a notepad filled with scribbled reminders, and at the very bottom, her old Marine cap, creased, sun-faded, and well-worn from years of dust and war. She never put it on anymore, but she always carried it. That cap had been with her through 2 combat tours and 3 firefights. It was the last surviving fragment of a chapter she didn't speak about, not even to herself. Her left leg, taken by an IED just outside Fallujah, had been replaced by a high-tech prosthetic. Matte black, quietly efficient, no polished chrome or flashy decals. Every step she took with it emitted a soft, deliberate click. Some people found the sound odd, maybe even off-putting. To Ava, it was a beat, a steady, simple rhythm that reminded her she was still going, still walking, still here. To most of her neighbors, she was just the quiet woman down the hall, respectful, keeps to herself, always alone. The kids sometimes stared, wide-eyed, when they caught a glimpse of her prosthetic leg. Occasionally, one of them would whisper a question when they thought she couldn't hear, but she never responded. She wasn't there to explain herself to curious strangers. Her silence wasn't retreat, it was boundary. At night, the quiet of her apartment was never complete. The memories returned like echoes through thin walls, uninvited, persistent. The whistle of incoming mortars, the crackle of radios gone dead, the feel of hot blood on her palms as she held pressure to someone's wound, trying to keep them alive. She often sat by the window deep into the night, long after the streets had emptied. Headlights would pass, cutting through the blinds like searchlights sweeping across a compound. Her body sat still, but her mind stayed on alert, caught somewhere between then and now. She never complained, never spoke of what she'd lost, never asked for recognition. Ava Morgan didn't wear her scars like decorations. She wore them like armor, silent, invisible, unwavering. Her war might have ended, but the discipline remained sharp as ever. And while the rest of the world had long since moved on, forgotten her sacrifice, Ava remembered. She remembered every damn day. That Tuesday, the Houston sun was merciless, high and heavy above the sprawling construction site, flooding everything in harsh, glaring light. Shadows stretched long and sharp between stacks of cinder blocks, tangled scaffolding, and half-built walls. The air shimmered above the pavement, thick with heat and the red dust kicked up by trucks groaning in and out of the lot. Sparks burst from welding torches. Voices shouted orders over the constant din, the machinery of progress grinding forward. Ava walked along the cracked sidewalk bordering the site, her prosthetic leg giving a soft, even click with each step. She'd made this walk dozens of times, heading to the VA clinic just 5 blocks away. Worn jeans, faded green t-shirt, skin darkened from long walks under the sun. She looked like someone on an errand, unnoticed by most. And most days that was true, but not today. "Hey!" someone yelled from behind the chain-link fence. "Wrong turn to the welfare office, sweetheart!" The words hung in the air for a moment, sharp and juvenile, before dissolving into laughter. Cruel, cheap, immature. Ava didn't stop. Her back straightened, her jaw tightened, her eyes stayed locked ahead. Let them throw their words. She'd heard worse from men in worse places. Above, on the second-story scaffolding, 3 workers in neon safety vests leaned over the edge, jostling one another with nudging elbows and grinning smirks. One of them even began to imitate her walk, exaggerated, mocking, ugly. But she didn't look up, didn't give them the satisfaction. Because Ava Morgan wasn't there for their approval. She had a mission, and nothing, not heat, not pain, and certainly not them, was going to stop her from walking forward. She walked with a slight limp. One of the men exaggerated his own steps, mimicking her, then fell over dramatically, fake screaming before bursting into laughter. "She probably got that leg discount at Goodwill," one of them snorted. At ground level stood their leader, Rick Tanner, the construction site's foreman. He was broad-shouldered, perpetually red-faced, and always squinting from under a sweat-stained baseball cap. A toothpick bobbed at the corner of his mouth, clenched with the same intensity he gave the clipboard in his hands. Tanner caught sight of Ava and saw not a person, not a veteran, but a chance to score a laugh. "Somebody call the VA," he bellowed loud enough for the entire crew to hear. Looks like one of their wind-up toys wandered off. The men erupted into laughter. Ava's fingers tightened around the brim of her marine cap. Her posture didn't waver. She kept walking, shoulders back, head held high. She didn't flinch, didn't falter. She had walked through gunfire. This was just noise. On the nearby sidewalk, a teenager, 17 maybe, already had her phone out, recording, grinning. "This is going viral," she whispered to the friend beside her. "Wait till TikTok sees the RoboCop lady." No one stepped in. No one said a word. A few workers shifted uncomfortably, glancing around, but stayed silent. Even the assistant site manager just stood there, arms crossed, doing nothing. Ava didn't yell, didn't even glance their way. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was discipline. Behind it were years of pain, hardship, and relentless training. Inside, something twisted, not with shame, but with a deep, ancient fatigue. This wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. Rick Tanner wasn't done. Bet she never even saw action, he sneered, his voice dripping with scorn. Probably just fell off a bar stool in San Diego. Louder laughter followed. More heads turned. More eyes followed her. Ava never turned back. She reached into the collar of her shirt and found her dog tags, the metal warm from resting against her skin. Her thumb traced the worn edges, sliding across the faded engravings, her name, her blood type, her branch. A quiet message pulsed in the metal. You endured, you served, you mattered. The laughter behind her began to fade. She kept walking, dust clinging to her boots, sweat trailing down her neck. Her pace never changed. No faster, no slower. But each step carved one more reason why she wouldn't let them see her break. She was nearing the corner when something caught her attention. Just a flicker in her peripheral vision. A black SUV parked half a block down, tinted windows, engine humming. Someone inside was watching. She didn't know it yet, but justice had already begun to move. Beyond the construction site, nestled under the speckled shade of a tall sycamore, sat a black Chevy Suburban. Its engine purred softly. The windshield, tinted just enough to conceal the man inside, wasn't hiding him. He wasn't there to hide. He was waiting. Logan Beck sat behind the wheel, elbows resting on the steering wheel, eyes locked on the scene 30 yards ahead, the moment unfolding like a familiar nightmare. He watched Ava Morgan limp past the site gate, surrounded by heckles and mocking laughter. His weathered face didn't flinch, but his jaw tightened ever so slightly. The Marine cap in her hand, the mechanical rhythm of her prosthetic, the way she never turned around. He remembered, not just this moment, but her, from years ago, from another battlefield entirely. He tugged up the cuff of his sleeve just enough to reveal the ink on his forearm, a golden trident entwined with an eagle and an anchor, the unmistakable emblem of a Navy SEAL. Faded but forever earned. The memory hit like shrapnel, vivid, brutal, and sharp. Fallujah. Dust storms and gunfire. Screams and blood. His team pinned down behind the ruins of a shattered convoy. 3 civilians bleeding out. And then, charging across open ground through sniper fire and smoke. Not once, not twice, 3 times. Each time she came back carrying someone. The 3rd trip, she didn't return whole. She never asked for recognition, never stood for the medal ceremonies. But Logan had, in his full dress uniform, polished shoes and ribbons on his chest. Still, he knew the truth. He remembered who made it all possible. He shouldn't have been standing there at all. But watching her get mocked, paraded in front of strangers like a charity case, something to be pitied, it sparked something inside him. Something that had been buried for years, dormant but never truly gone. His hand moved without hesitation, no second guessing. He picked up the phone and spoke in a voice that was low, controlled, and razor sharp. It's Beck. Send the convoy. It's time. Then he ended the call and tucked the phone back into the dash tray. In that instant, Logan Beck wasn't just some retired Navy SEAL passing time in the civilian world. He was a brother again, a warrior. And there are things you don't do. One of them is laughing at a Marine who once dragged your bleeding body out of hell, at least not without being taught what honor actually means. Ava Morgan had grown up in a quiet corner of Kentucky, in a place where dusty roads far outnumbered paved ones. Mornings there started early before dawn, with the clatter of tractors and the sharp crow of roosters. Her family ran a small farm on the outskirts of Richmond. They raised soybeans and just barely managed to scrape by, enough to keep the lights on, but never quite enough to feel secure. From a young age, Ava knew what it meant to work hard. She knew the satisfaction that came from putting your head down and doing what had to be done, even if no one ever thanked you for it. Her father didn't say much, but his hands were steady and his word was solid. Her mother taught her how to mend a torn shirt, ride a horse bareback, and patch a broken fence line all before she turned 12. But by the time Ava hit 18, It was clear to her that the farm wasn't her destiny. The soil was worn out. Her parents were getting older, and she refused to let her life shrink into the same furrows she'd been digging since she could walk. So she walked into the Marine Corps recruiting office with nothing but a high school diploma, a backbone of steel, and a will that wouldn't bend. Boot camp didn't shake her like it did the others, not for a girl who'd been stacking hay bales since she could form a full sentence. She didn't shout, didn't boast, but she learned fast. She was sharp, unshakable, and fiercely protective of the people around her. She never craved applause, just purpose. By her second deployment, Ava had become the kind of Marine you trusted without needing to ask why. Then came Fallujah, third month of patrols. The mission was routine: escort a convoy delivering medical supplies through a dense urban zone. The streets were narrow, the buildings too close, the atmosphere wired. The IED was buried deep beneath the asphalt, hidden and remote triggered. It exploded just as the lead vehicle crossed an intersection. The shockwave shredded the air, tore through glass and steel, and flipped the Humvee like it weighed nothing. The engine caught fire. Ava didn't wait. She ran straight into the inferno, through smoke, through flying shrapnel. She pulled a corpsman out first, bloodied, unconscious. Then she dragged a civilian aid worker screaming in agony, his burns fresh and raw, into the safety of a median. And still she went back. Third trip. She reached for a fellow Marine pinned beneath what was left of a support beam, twisted like ribbon. That's when the second blast hit. She woke up in a hospital bed in Ramstein, Germany. Her left leg was gone below the knee. Her file noted a silver star, a purple heart, and the kind of respect from her unit that can't be bought, only earned. But medals can't protect you from what comes next. Coming home felt like crossing into another kind of battlefield, a silent one. Employers noticed the prosthetic long before they saw her qualifications. One manager mumbled something about liability. Another slid her resume aside without looking her in the eye. "This job's long hours on your feet," he'd said, like she didn't already know. Nobody asked about Fallujah. Nobody asked who she'd carried out of that fire or what it had cost her. To them, she was just a risk, a story with too much weight, a reminder of something they'd rather ignore. So the same woman who once ran into explosions without blinking had to brace herself just to walk into a grocery store, bracing for the stares, the whispered questions, and sometimes, worst of all, the well-meaning pity. That day on the yeast site, the heat had crested to its worst, thick air shimmering off sunburned faces, sweat sticking like syrup. Laughter from earlier still clung to the air, but now it had thinned, frayed at the edges. Some workers had gone back to hammering, but most of them kept sneaking glances at the sidewalk, waiting to see if Ava would turn around and give them hell. She didn't, but someone else did. A sound rumbled down the street, echoed, low and guttural, not a dump truck, not a cement mixer. This was something else entirely, the unmistakable growl of military-grade engines. 3 black SUVs approached, dark windows gleaming beneath the sun. They had no one left to call. She came. She didn't hesitate. And now you humiliate her because you think it's funny, because it gets you a laugh. His voice didn't rise, but the quiet around him made every word hit like a hammer. He leaned in just slightly, his presence looming, controlled, but unmistakably dangerous. Rick Tanner's hands twitched by his sides. He couldn't meet Beck's eyes anymore. The heat on his face wasn't just from the sun. He tried to speak again, maybe to defend himself, but the words collapsed before they reached his tongue. Behind Logan, the others remained still, unflinching, each one like a coiled weapon, ready if called. But none moved because they didn't have to. Their silence spoke volumes. A foreman used to barking orders. Rick now stood as though every ounce of authority had been stripped from him. Beck's eyes narrowed. "You're going to apologize," he said, not giving it as a suggestion, but as fact. "You're going to apologize to her, and you're going to mean it." Rick gave a feeble nod, swallowing hard. "And you're going to do it before the end of the day," Beck added, loud enough for the rest of the crew to hear. "Because if you don't, we'll make sure the people writing your paychecks see what kind of man you really are." Rick's mouth moved again, a pathetic attempt at words, but again, nothing came out. Logan didn't wait. He turned away, the moment already over in his mind, leaving Rick frozen in place like a man waiting for a sentence to drop. The others moved as he moved, silent and synchronized. Like shadows pulled back into their source, they returned to their vehicles in precise reverse order, one after another. Doors shut. Engines came to life with the same soft hum they'd arrived on. Not a single man looked back. The convoy pulled away from the Wafene just as calmly as it had appeared, silent, sure, and unshakable. And though Ava Morgan never saw them coming, she would know, sooner or later, that someone had shown up. Someone had made it right. The insurgents had been closing in fast, bullets cutting through the air like whips. And yet she had sprinted, again and again, through that kill zone, not once, not twice, but 3 times. While others would have been crying into their radios, begging for an extraction, she ran straight into the fire. Logan Beck's jaw tightened, eyes narrowing into sharp slits as he faced the man before him. "And you," he said with quiet fury, "you think she's a joke? A form of entertainment?" A low stir moved through the growing crowd. Curious passersby had begun to gather, drawn not just by the line of black SUVs, but by the unmistakable current of something tense and righteous unraveling in the open. Some had their phones out, not to mock, not to laugh, but to capture what was clearly becoming something unforgettable. Reverence had replaced ridicule. Beck turned to face the onlookers, his voice cutting clean through the charged silence. "You laughed at a woman who served with more honor than most men will in their lifetime. That ends right now." Rick Tanner's mouth opened again, this time to mutter something that might have been an apology, but it was too late. The damage was done, the reckoning already in motion. Beck didn't wait for a reply. With a deliberate turn of his back to the foreman, he issued a silent but unmistakable message. Behind him, the entire SEAL team moved as one, aligning into position without a word. The air seemed to shift, as if the very ground understood the gravity of what was unfolding. Ava Morgan had nearly reached the end of the block. Her head was down, her breath steady, her pace quick but not rushed, until she heard them. Footsteps, not the kind that chased or charged, but measured even. Intentional. She slowed, then turned, and what she saw made her stop in her tracks. Logan Beck was walking toward her, not with urgency but with a solemn purpose, the kind of pace reserved for sacred ground. Behind him, the 6 other SEALs followed in silent formation. There were no more jeers, no more construction noise, no clatter of steel. Even the wind seemed to pause. All that remained was the steady sound of boots hitting concrete and the weight of something deeper than words. Logan stopped just a few feet from her. His face didn't betray much, but his eyes held something Ava hadn't felt in years. It wasn't pity, it wasn't confusion or curiosity, it was recognition. Steady, grounded, respect without condition. He stood at attention. Then, in a tone that was both crisp and low, he said, "Permission to honor you, ma'am." Ava blinked. For a second, she couldn't quite process the words. But then it hit her. Before she could speak, Logan raised his hand in a clean textbook salute. Instantly, every man behind him followed suit. It wasn't casual. It wasn't for show. It was the kind of salute reserved for the fallen, the brave, the warriors who walked through hell and came out changed. Their postures were flawless, shoulders squared, back straight, eyes locked forward. A wall of unshakable reverence. Ava didn't move. Her throat tightened, heart thudding with something sharp and buried. And then, from someplace deep inside her, older than memory, her arm lifted. Fingers curved with precise practiced strength, she returned the salute. Not out of vanity or pride, but instinct. The kind that had been etched into her down to the marrow. But this time, it didn't feel mechanical. It didn't feel like routine. It felt right. It felt earned. Logan lowered his hand slowly, then reached into a pocket on his tactical vest and drew out something small and metallic. It glinted in the sun, silver edge, circular, engraved with the trident symbol of the SEALs. He stepped forward and held it out between both hands. "This," he said, voice firm but quiet, "is the Brotherhood coin, Navy SEAL issue. It's not given, it's earned." He placed it gently into her palm, then closed her fingers around it. "You earned it in Fallujah, but you never got it. Because you were too damn busy saving lives. She looked down at the coin. Her fingers trembled. When her eyes lifted back to his, they shimmered. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came. Words failed her. The moment pressed into her like the weight of armor she hadn't worn in years. Armor now returned to her, piece by piece. Around them, no one spoke. No one moved. Even the young woman who had earlier been recording Ava's humiliation now stood with her phone hanging forgotten at her side, her face etched with something closer to remorse than curiosity. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Ava Morgan stood tall, not with apology, not with shame, but with quiet, unshakable dignity. She was no longer invisible. She didn't need to explain herself. She didn't need to fight to be seen. She was honored. The footage of the confrontation spread like wildfire. Within hours, clips of Logan Beck's declaration, "She dragged me out of a burning Humvee," had reached every corner of the internet. News channels picked it up by evening. Veteran groups reposted it with captions like, "This is what honoring service looks like." By morning, the headquarters of the construction company had been overwhelmed with a tidal wave of public outcry. Emails, phone calls, comments, messages, all echoing one demand: make it right. And within 24 hours, they did. Across the company's website and all of its social media accounts, a formal apology appeared in bold print. "We deeply regret every ounce of disrespect that had been directed towards Sergeant Ava Morgan was now being countered, publicly and powerfully. The woman who had once been mocked for her uniform, for her sacrifice, was now being upheld as a symbol of what it truly meant to serve with honor. Her courage, her resilience, and the price she paid in the name of duty were no longer subjects of ridicule. They were finally receiving the reverence they always deserved." The official statement from the company didn't just offer apologies, it promised change. With firm resolve, it declared that their construction sites would no longer be just workplaces, but environments of respect and accountability. It was more than words. Rick Tanner, the site foreman whose disrespect had sparked the outrage, was promptly removed from the project. Reassigned to off-site duties for an indefinite period, his punishment was swift, but what followed was even more meaningful. A week later, Ava received a letter she hadn't anticipated. It came from the principal of Roosevelt High School, located only a couple miles away from the construction zone that had become the center of so much attention. The letter invited her to speak to the students as part of their upcoming Veterans Appreciation Week. At first, Ava hesitated. Speaking to a crowd, especially one full of teenagers, was something she had never imagined herself doing. She wasn't used to stages, microphones, or being the center of attention. She wasn't interested in pity or praise. But this invitation felt different. This wasn't about medals, commendations, or patriotic gestures. It was about honesty. It was about telling her story, scars and all, to kids who were still forming their ideas of strength and courage. That, she felt, was worth doing. So she said yes. That Friday morning dawned crisp and cool, the kind of day that carried the faint promise of change. Ava stepped onto the stage at Roosevelt High's auditorium, wearing a crisp, clean blouse and the Marine Corps cap she hadn't worn in over 10 years. The room fell silent as she approached the podium. The soft, steady rhythm of her prosthetic leg tapping against the stage echoed in the stillness. She didn't lecture. She didn't dramatize. There were no war stories, no images projected behind her, just her voice, calm, deliberate. She looked out into the sea of young faces and said, "Scars don't mean you're broken. They mean you survived something that tried to break you, and you kept walking." Applause rose up almost instantly. Some of the students were on their feet. A few had tears in their eyes. The teachers, many of whom had seen decades of assemblies, clapped the longest and the hardest. Ava's words had landed somewhere deep. But the transformation wasn't just confined to applause in an auditorium. Back at the job site, change began to take root in a more tangible form. The company decided not to just issue statements, but to embed their commitment physically into the landscape. At the front gate of the site, a single brick was placed into the ground, bordered by polished steel and set into fresh concrete. The brick wasn't flashy. There were no lights, no glass cases, no guards, just a name and a message: etched in clean, deliberate lettering. SGT Ava Morgan, built on respect. It wasn't tall, it wasn't grand, but it was permanent. And every worker walked past it, day in and day out. Some glanced, some paused and gave it a respectful nod. A few reached out, pressing their hand gently to the metal frame before clocking in. That small brick became more than a memorial. It became a mirror, a quiet but powerful reminder of what it costs when dignity is dismissed and what it looks like when a community chooses to remember instead of forget. In the days and weeks that followed, something subtle began to shift across the site. At first, it was nothing more than a few hushed conversations between shifts. But slowly, momentum grew. The culture started to bend, ever so slightly, towards something better. Workers who had once rolled their eyes at terms like sensitivity training now signed up for a new program titled Respect in the Trades. Not because it was required, but because, for the first time, they truly understood what a lack of respect had cost them. The first session was awkward. It was filled with stiff silences, calloused hands, and skeptical glances beneath dusty hard hats. But then Miguel, a fellow veteran, stood up and shared something that cut through the discomfort. He spoke about his brother, also a disabled Marine, who had been turned away from 4 job interviews. The reason? Safety concerns. It was a moment of truth that cracked something open in the room. By the 3rd session, men were paying attention. By the 5th, they were speaking, sharing moments they'd stayed quiet when they should have spoken up, admitting the regret they'd carried for years without ever naming it. These weren't sweeping speeches. They were small, personal, and raw. But they were real, and that was enough to start the healing. Through it all, Ava remained in the background. She didn't ask to be a symbol. She didn't want it. But sometimes the world chooses its symbols not from medals and monuments, but from the quiet survivors who wear their scars without shame. One afternoon, as she sat alone outside a cafe just 2 blocks from the construction site, sipping coffee and enjoying a rare moment of calm, a small figure approached. He couldn't have been more than 7 or 8. He had freckles, a bowl haircut, and a red hoodie that covered a prosthetic arm peeking from one sleeve. He stood next to her table in silence, unsure whether to speak. Then he said softly, "My mom says I'm like you." Ava looked up surprised. "She says I don't need 2 arms to be strong," the boy continued. "She says maybe I can be a hero too." For a moment, Ava didn't speak. She felt something move deep in her chest, a tenderness that no scar could harden. She leaned forward slightly, meeting his eyes with quiet conviction. "You already are," she told him. "Every day you wake up and choose to keep going, you're already a hero." The boy's face lit up, not with the courteous smile kids often wear to please adults, but with the pure, unfiltered joy that comes from being truly seen. His entire expression transformed into a beam of light, wide-eyed and proud, and he took off running toward his mother. She stood a short distance away, watching with tears already pooling in her eyes. She didn't need words to understand what had just happened. Her son had been honored, recognized not as broken, but as brave. Word of Ava's quiet act of kindness spread far beyond the reach of the viral video. It rippled outward, carried on the breath of those who had witnessed it, shared in coffee shops, classrooms, and veterans' halls. Veterans began visiting the construction site just to lay a hand on the small honor brick, as if touching it grounded them in something bigger than themselves. Schools began scheduling field trips to the site. Teachers rewrote lesson plans. The construction company, once the center of controversy, expanded its respect and inclusion training to every regional team under its name. And across town, people started asking questions, new ones. Not just what happened, but what can we change? As it turned out, respect was contagious. All it had taken was one woman, standing her ground with dignity when the world had tried to laugh her down. Ava Morgan hadn't flinched. She had refused to look away or bow her head, and that courage had ignited something the entire community hadn't realized they'd been longing for. 6 months after that unforgettable day at the construction site, Ava stood backstage at the National Veterans Conference in Washington, D.C. She was moments away from stepping in front of a packed auditorium as the keynote speaker, something she had never dreamed would happen. She wasn't a politician. She wasn't a best-selling author with a message polished by publicists and sound bites. She didn't come with a book tour or a documentary team in tow, but maybe that was exactly why she was the one chosen. The country didn't need another curated persona. It needed someone who understood, someone who had lived through silence, who knew the shape of sacrifice and the weight of dignity that didn't need to shout. A Navy SEAL had once told her, "You never asked for recognition." That had been true. She never had. But now, Ava Morgan had something even more powerful than recognition. She had a voice, and she was going to use it. The lights dimmed as she stepped onto the stage. A hush fell over the room, the kind that settled deep, not from obligation, but reverence. Row after row of faces looked up. Active duty service members in uniform, veterans with medals on their lapels, military families holding loved ones close, national leaders with pens poised, ready to listen. In the front row, two faces stood out immediately. Logan Beck sat tall in his dress blues, arms folded across his chest, not in defiance, but with a deep, respectful stillness. Beside him was the boy from the cafe, the same boy with the prosthetic arm, now wearing a miniature Marine Corps jacket his mother had lovingly sewn by hand. His small fingers clutched a shiny challenge coin, the one Ava had given him during their second encounter, and he held it against his chest as though it were a shield. Ava walked up to the podium and stood tall, her posture proud and unflinching. The stage lights caught the glint of her prosthetic, partially visible beneath the hem of her skirt. She didn't try to hide it. She never would again. She took a deep breath and began. "I used to think honor came from medals," she said softly. "From ranks, from salutes, from the way people stand when you walk into a room." Her voice didn't need volume, it had weight. "But I've learned something since then. Honor doesn't care how many limbs you've got, or whether you can march in perfect time. It comes from how you stand when everything around you tries to break you." The silence in the auditorium was absolute. Not a cough, not a whisper, no rustling of paper or shifting of feet, just breath, suspended. "Some of us come home whole," Ava continued. "Some of us don't. Some scars you can see, some stay hidden, but every single one of them matters." She paused, her eyes locking onto the boy in the front row. "Courage doesn't always roar," she said gently. "Sometimes it walks with a limp. Sometimes it wears a little red hoodie and holds its head high." The boy's eyes widened and a smile lit his face. A quiet, fierce kind of pride that only someone who'd been seen could wear. The applause came slowly at first, a single pair of hands, then a few more, until the entire auditorium was on its feet. The standing ovation built until it echoed like rolling thunder through the high ceilings, lasting over 2 full minutes. Ava stepped back from the microphone, not to soak it in, but to share it. For so long, she had walked this road alone, but now she stood on that stage with thousands behind her, and for the first time since the war, she allowed herself to feel something she had long buried: pride. Back in her hometown, the brick outside the construction site had transformed. It wasn't just a token anymore. It was a destination. Veterans came from across the state and then from across the country. Some arrived on motorcycles, their jackets weathered and patched with unit insignias faded by time and rain. Others came slowly, painfully, leaning on walking canes, knees stiff with age, hands trembling as they reached down to touch the name etched into stone. For many, it was the first time they had seen a piece of their story honored out in the open, and the community followed. Students came to learn, teachers brought history alive, families came to lay flowers, not just in mourning but in thanks. What had begun as a moment of shame, a cruel confrontation caught on video, had grown into something sacred. Not just a monument of stone, but a living, breathing memory etched into hearts, a testimony to what it means to stand tall when the world tries to make you small. A movement began to take root, subtle at first, but unstoppable. It all started online, sparked by a phrase posted by the same teenager who once held up her phone to ridicule. "Let respect be louder than laughter." That simple sentence ignited something. The hashtag spread like wildfire across social platforms, and then the stories began to flood in. Veterans, nurses, firefighters, amputees, cancer survivors. One after another, people stepped forward, not to ask for sympathy, but to declare their resilience. They spoke not just of survival, but of pride. Their scars weren't hidden, they were worn like badges, not because they wanted attention, but because those marks told the truth. They were still here, not in spite of the pain, because of it. Later, at the closing of her keynote address at the National Veterans Conference, Ava Morgan stood in front of a packed room, the spotlight warm on her face. There was no trace of fear or hesitation. She looked out into the sea of faces, some teary, some stoic, all listening, and delivered her final message. Scars aren't shame. They're proof you survived. The audience rose as one, not in celebration of a well-crafted speech, but in recognition of a truth too often left unspoken. They were applauding not her words, but her courage, the kind that had carried her through humiliation, cruelty, and silence. Ava had stood in the public square, mocked by strangers, and still managed to rise without bitterness or hatred in her heart. She never asked to become a symbol. That was never the plan. But now, whether she liked it or not, Ava Morgan had become a living reminder that heroes don't always arrive in uniforms or capes. Sometimes they limp through grocery store aisles. Sometimes they sit quietly at bus stops. Sometimes they salute a flag while laying bricks under the unforgiving sun. Their strength is quiet, steady, unbreakable. What started as a cruel prank under the blistering Houston sun had transformed into something deeper, a reflection held up to all of us. A question burned into its surface. How do we treat the ones who've already given everything they had? Ava's story isn't just about a salute or a job site or even about her alone. It's about something much bigger. It's about the dignity that should never have to be earned. Dignity that ought to be offered freely simply because we all deserve to be seen, especially when no one else is looking. Respect doesn't come from medals or titles, or whether someone walks with a straight back or a cane. It's about how we choose to see each other in the quiet moments, the forgotten corners of everyday life. In today's America, where the loudest voice often drowns out the wisest heart, we need stories like this. We need them now more than ever. For those who have lived long enough to understand that volume doesn't equal valor, that the loudest one in the room is rarely the bravest. True courage, it walks past us in silence. It holds a worn-out cap. It never asks for applause. So let me ask you, have you ever witnessed someone being mocked for what made them different and found yourself wishing you'd said something? What does honor look like where you live, in your neighborhood, in your family, in your day-to-day life? I'd love to know. Share your thoughts in the comments. Maybe tell us about a moment when your faith in people was restored, or about that quiet, unsung hero who shows up every day, asking for nothing and giving everything. If Ava's story moved something in you, help it move others too. Like, share, and subscribe for more true stories that cut through the noise and speak straight to the heart, especially to the hearts of those from generations who understand that quiet strength is the most enduring kind. Stories of resilience, of honor, of people who never gave up. And remember this, sometimes the smallest acts, like a salute or laying a single brick, can rebuild far more than we realize. Not just the walls around us, but the ones within us. Thank you for listening. Until next time.